Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
We have a great show lined up for you guys today. The first thing that I wanted to talk about is there are some new things that are coming for Intune, specifically Autopilot, that we wanted to go over with on today's show. First thing is that Autopilot for existing devices went generally available at the end of June this year. If you haven't heard of Autopilot for existing devices, it's a new way to get existing devices, including on-premise joined devices, into Autopilot by using config-man and a task sequence to deliver a JSON file to the device. And the end result is an enter-joined or a hybrid enter-joined Autopilot device. There are a few caveats. It only works with the user-driven Autopilot experience. So if you're familiar with Autopilot, there's two different types of Autopilot profiles. One is user-driven, where the user walks through the different menu functions, and then there's a self-deploying or pre-provisioned version of Autopilot where it might just go through it on its own, and those are usually like kiosks or something that it's like a shared machine where it will pre-provision or self-deploy the whole thing and go through it. For the majority of users, we use the user-driven one where the user clicks through each of them. So this particular Autopilot for existing devices will only work with user-driven deployments. And then if there's already an Autopilot profile assigned to it, or it's an Autopilot device, that existing profile will take precedent over the one that you're trying to deliver through the JSON file.
Andy, before you go any further, maybe we should take a step back. And if folks aren't familiar with what Windows Autopilot is, maybe we should mention that briefly. So first off, Autopilot, not related to Copilot, which is kind of the current trend at Microsoft. It actually predates it by many, many years. Autopilot is a version of Windows and device management that all work together to deliver an experience where a user can unbox a PC or reset a PC. And in the out-of-box experience, the UBI, the device will be recognized as it's part of an organization. So it'll say, oh, you belong to Contoso or Woodgrove or whomever. And let's have you log in with your Contoso credentials, and we'll get this configured for corporate work. It's similar, if you're familiar with Apple's automated device enrollment with Apple Business Manager, very similar to that conceptually, where it kind of takes over that out-of-box experience, and then IT can pre-configure a lot of the settings so that it's a more streamlined enrollment experience. I've had this at Microsoft, where when I got my most recent company-issued device, they shipped me a shrink-wrapped Surface Book 3. I unwrapped it, opened it up, connected it to power, it connected to Wi-Fi and the out-of-box experience, and it detected, hey, you belong to Microsoft, put in your corporate credentials, and let's go. And from there, it pulled down everything I needed to be productive in terms of apps and configuration and settings and all of that. So Autopilot's been around for a while. What Andy's talking about for existing devices is a kind of a new opportunity to take your existing fleet of devices that maybe didn't have Autopilot when you bought them, and now enabling them for Autopilot if they need to be reset or reissued. Now you can deliver that experience even if they're not new in box and shrink wrapped, which is what people have traditionally associated Autopilot with.
Exactly. And Autopilot used to be a little bit more kludgy, where you would have to import the Autopilot hash into Intune and then assign a profile to it, and then you'd have to reboot it in order for the Autopilot experience to actually take over. And this is a way to do it with on-premise devices just via Configuration Manager, which is pretty cool and very new. So one of the changes that's actually coming to this specific feature that just went GA is starting on September 5th of this year, Intune will block Autopilot for existing devices for customers that have blocked enrollment of personal devices using enrollment restrictions. And that is because any device that enrolls through Autopilot for existing devices with a valid JSON file is marked as corporate by default and allowed to enroll in Intune, regardless of if it's owned by the organization or not. So this is a very small point, but really important, is that Autopilot is not management. Autopilot's the enrollment experience where it helps you, like Adam says, it tells you you're part of an organization, you're automatically prompted for your corporate credentials. Once it walks you through that, it enrolls in Intune management at the end of it and delivers all of your applications and policies, versus where if you were to sign in with, normally through the UBI, it might prompt you to either enroll for work or a personal device. And at the end of that, depending on which one you pick, it would go through the steps. When you enroll in a device in Intune, it can either be marked as corporate or personal. When you enroll in Intune, it really depends on which one it is, and the policies that are assigned to it, depending on whether it's personal or corporate, may differ. And so this particular one is pretty important, because if you have a device that's not actually owned by the organization and you allow it to be enrolled through this fashion with a valid JSON file, then it will be marked as corporate, and certain policies may apply to it that, if it is actually a personal device, that may not be something that you want to do. And there's right now no way to differentiate with that. And so for security purposes, Intune will just block the enrollment of personal devices through this fashion. There are a couple ways that you can enhance security for enrollment and ownership. You can upload device identities by registering for Autopilot or upload corporate identifiers. So you can either run that import-autopilot device PowerShell script to register the devices that you want to enroll in Autopilot based on their hardware hash, but you have to collect those hashes. And so there's a way to collect those hashes, and it can be a little bit kludgy, but if you're able to do that, you can then import them into Autopilot. This has been done for many years. You can also upload Windows corporate identifiers for each device that you plan to deploy, and then you can use restriction assignment filters to block any unknown enrollment profiles or any unknown corporate identifiers.
You forgot one other one, Andy. Your OEM can also upload those hashes on your behalf. So that goes back to that experience I was talking about. So if you're with Dell, Lenovo, HP, Microsoft, for your Windows PCs, you can set it up with them so that as you buy, like, say, new ThinkPads, their hashes are automatically added to your tenant as you buy them and deploy them as well. That's how you deliver that out-of-box experience with removing the shrink wrap that I referenced earlier. So that's the third method to make devices known as corporate identified devices.
Thanks for the call out, Adam. Yeah, that would be the easiest way to start configuring all of your devices for Autopilot. And then finally, this one's pretty important. Enable enrollment notifications to monitor any new device enrollments. You can configure Intune to send you an email notification and or someone else, like your boss, whenever a new device enrolls in your tenant. This helps you detect any unauthorized or suspicious enrollment activity. For example, last night, I was messing around and I wanted to spin up my corporate issued Surface Book 3 to try to test out for a new way of working in my home office. So I enrolled it in Intune, and it, of course, automatically sent me and my manager, this is how Microsoft has configured it, a email that says, hey, you've enrolled a new device, and by administrative policy, the manager is supposed to verify with each of their, subordinates whether or not that is actually a device that they did. And so I just preemptively replied to the email to my boss and said, hey, it's just me on a Saturday night spinning up my Surface Book 3 for work. Mm-hmm. So that's a really important one to do, because it's always good to monitor if you have new devices that are enrolling under your identifier.
And let me plus one on that too. Andy and I often talk about how requiring managed devices is a very strong control in conditional access with Entra ID. That control is only as valuable as your controls around managing what is enrolled. If you have no control over what's enrolled, then that delivers very little protection. So, what Andy's talking about is a really good idea. The other important part, and Andy referenced this, is creating a culture where that is actionable. And if it just fires off an email and everyone ignores and goes, oh, whatever, and your manager doesn't follow up with you, it's really not doing a lot of good. I will tell you, in my most recent experience, I enrolled a new device and my manager made sure to send me a message on Teams the moment they saw it saying, hey, was this really you? That's the culture you have to instill with it, or it's just noise. And so all of those things are really helpful. And not saying you have to do it this way, but just in terms of how you think about the chain of trust. And if we're going to do something, let's make sure it's valuable and it's not just activity for activities.
Moving on, continuing with our new features, Intune enrollment attestation is now generally available. And this is where the MDM ID is stored in the TPM rather than in exportable certs that are, and the MDM ID is bound to that device. So this will stop an APT technique where we've seen attackers export an MDM device cert from an enterprise device to attack like a VM in the cloud, where they might be able to avoid other detection tools or EDR or something like that. There are some operating system restrictions. The documentation will be linked for the exact OS versions, but to say the least, it does work with Windows 10. It's the very latest version of Windows 10 that's in production, and then a few versions of Windows 11. You must have TPM 2.0 on the device, and it only works with physical devices. So VMs are not included in this. When a user enrolls a Windows device with TPM 2.0, the Windows attestation ensures that the enrollment credentials are stored securely on the hardware of that device. And once the device has successfully attested and is healthy, then the user can continue with MDM enrollment. So there is kind of a little bit of a circle. You'll usually sign in with Entra, and then those credentials will prompt the enrollment process. But the first part is to pull that MDM ID down, put it into the TPM, do the attestation part of it before you can actually enroll in MDM. And once the device is healthy, then you can continue. There is a report in Intune that you can look at and pull up the device health of each one of your devices that is trying to enroll. And you can see if it's healthy or if there was an issue with the attestation. Like, for example, like the TPM is not 2.0 is one example. So once you have that portion of it kind of reporting back to you, there's a new device filter. Is TPM attested, which is the flag for it, which then you can use to filter all sorts of different things, but you can use it for enrollment instructions. So at a certain point, once you have a fleet of healthy devices that are all attested, you can then say only these type of devices can enroll in management. So just another way to continue in that security journey to get more and more secure devices. All right, our final one is MAM, which is mobile. Oh my goodness,
Mobile application management.
Mobile application management. I blanked for a second there. Mobile application management, which is like a Intune Lite, if you will. We've talked about MAM versus MDM, mobile device management, before, but MAM capabilities are now available for Windows 365 and AVD clients on Windows, iOS, padOS, and Android clients. So previously, supporting a bring your own device was a challenge because AVD or Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365 end users had the same redirections when they connected from a corporate or a personal device. That means that when they connect to an Azure Virtual Desktop session or a Windows 365 session, the redirection of the clipboard or specific physical drives that are attached to the host of the machine that you're literally on can be redirected into that virtual session. So if I copy something from the host, I can paste it in the virtual session. If I have like a C drive or a D drive or a USB even, that can be redirected into the host, and you can copy and paste information from your host drive into the virtual session. Now, again, that obviously is a bit of a challenge with information leak going one way from the host, if it's a corporate machine, into the host, from the virtual machine into the host machine, or you could have contamination of personal information go from the host machine into a corporate VM. And there wasn't a way to block that. You can only block it all, or you can either allow redirection or not allow redirection, was the only two things that were available. That's no longer the case. So as a review, things that you can do as mobile application management, or MAM, is you can now specifically disable redirections to personal devices. You can also require PIN access to an app before connection. We usually talk about this like if you want to secure like the mobile app or any app really, if you don't have management of that device. So again, MAM is a way to protect data and leakage and corporate data without actually having to manage the device. So I'm not going to require you to have like a PIN on your device, but if you're going to access Outlook with corporate data on it, I'm going to require you to have a PIN to open up that Outlook app. You can also block third-party keyboards. You can specify a minimum device operating system version before you're connecting. You can specify a minimum Windows app or remote desktop app version before connecting. You can block jailbroken or rooted devices, and you can require a mobile threat defense solution on the device with no threats before connecting. So a lot of different things that you can do. Again, there's always like a conversation or argument of whether we should use MAM, whether we should use MDM. If you're on a managed device, MAM is actually optional, but you can use it with MDM. So on a managed device, you can do MDM plus MAM. On unmanaged devices, MAM is highly recommended if you're allowing users to access corporate data without fully managing the device. If you're like, oh, that's too heavy-handed, I don't want to require your device to have a 6-digit PIN or do all sorts of other things, push your mobile threat defense onto it. Well, you can still use MAM as a management light in order to protect your corporate data. So the newest thing is that you can configure redirection policies specifically for unmanaged devices. So if I have an unmanaged device, I can now use MAM to say I want to block the host storage, like the iPad's local storage, from appearing within the Windows 365 or AVD instance or your Windows machine that you're connecting to or whatever. So that redirection is now available to be blocked specifically for unmanaged devices if you don't want that to happen. Other things that you want to look at, again, when you're configuring MAM, you should require a minimum operating system. And that is something that should change when new operating systems are updated. So I always kept track of the newest iPad OS or iOS version or Windows version, and I would update that policy within MAM to keep up so that it forces people to update as well. You should also look at a minimum app version, because the versions of the app will get updated for different reasons, like older devices may not be supported, or they might have a security update to that specific app. And then finally, if you're using like MDE or any other mobile threat detector connector that works with Intune, you can require the device to be secure as well. That's pretty important. There are certain mobile threat defense partners that will automatically connect to Intune and give that status to Intune that you can use as a compliance flag of whether or not you can connect or not. And, some of them on the list, Lookout has been on there for a while. Obviously, Defender for endpoint, CrowdStrike Falcon for mobile, Checkpoint Harmony for mobile, Zimperium. Those are just a few of the more popular ones. But there's a whole list on here, mobile threat defense partners, which I'll put the documentation in the show notes. If you aren't using that, it is definitely something that is recommended to have.
So MAM's been around for a long time, going all the way back to, at least when I started at Microsoft, 2017, if not earlier, and originally just iOS and Android, and now has expanded to Windows as well. It's such a logical next step to extend it to things like remote desktop and Windows app, because this is one of the most picture-perfect scenarios to help protect. I think it's overall too heavy-handed to require a completely managed device to access what's essentially a remote desktop. That seems like it's not commensurate with the risk. However, I do understand there are still risks of cross-contamination, data leakage, things we want to protect against. And so that's where MAM just makes perfect sense, where if I'm accessing my cloud PC from my own iPad or from my own Windows PC, some common sense restrictions make total sense. And so this is a great option to bring that in. But Andy, as you mentioned, this does extend to other applications as well, especially in iOS and Android, where it's been around for years. It's a great scenario to enable like lightweight, say I just want email on my phone, and I really uncomfortable with being like fully corporate enrolled, but I would love it if I could get my email on my phone. You can stand up Outlook with a PIN, with sandbox encryption of the mail store, restrict cut, copy, and paste, restrict attachments from moving outside the app. Basically everything you need to be confident that data is secure and safe. And I love the call out on application versions as well, and OS versions, maybe more importantly, making sure we're requiring minimum OS updates. And again, like with iOS devices, even though not everyone will take like the new iOS 18 update in the fall, or maybe their phone doesn't support it, Apple continues to ship security updates for at least -1, if not -2 versions of iOS. And so you can stay up to date with those version numbers and require those. That way you're not requiring everyone to be on the latest and greatest phone, but you are requiring them to be up to date on their security patching. And that seems like a reasonable compromise. Although one could make an argument that Apple supports such old hardware with current iOS that in reality, maybe that's just a fair expectation of accessing corporate data. But anyhow, MAM is really cool. This is a great use case for it. But if you've not looked at it before, it extends well beyond this use cases.
And the one obvious thing that I think a lot of security professionals will ask about all the things that we've listed is screenshot limitation. And there is screen protection for AVD and Windows 365 that you can configure to prevent either remote sharing or screenshots within the VM itself. But I think it goes along to the lines of you can't protect every single thing, like especially on like mobile devices. People can obviously take screenshots of emails and Teams messages and stuff like that. And so there is, it does come to a point where you would have to essentially take multiple screenshots of different things in order to exfiltrate the
a reasonable
data.
amount of data.
Yeah. So, but for AVD and Windows 365, screenshot blocking and remote sharing is something that you can enable within either GPO or Intune policy. All right. So that is our show for this week. Hopefully this was all good information for you, because it was definitely new to us as we read through it. This is all pretty recent stuff. So all the links to the articles and blogs that we used for the show will be in the show notes, as well as our information, our contact, if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.